Imagine a society, right, that spent centuries just weaponizing its own environment, like literally burning its way across continents and demanding absolute supremacy.
Yeah, a society whose whole historical fingerprint was basically nothing but ashes and subjugation.
Exactly. Now imagine that exact same society somehow transforming into the world's most profound center for emotional healing and like self-awareness. It sounds impossible, but that is the journey we are taking you on today.
It really is a massive pivot.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping in as your cultural historians to look at the world of the Fire Nation, specifically during the Soriyuna era.
Which is such a fascinating time period.
It really is. Our mission today is to pull apart the mechanics of this radical cultural reinvention. We're looking at how an entire civilization stopped treating fire as a tool of dominance and, reclaimed it as this living presence, as generative warmth.
And setting the historical context here is so vital because a shift of this magnitude, it doesn't just happen overnight with a simple political decree.
Right. You can't just mandate that.
Exactly. You cannot just pass a law to erase generations of imperial indoctrination. Like the diplomatic apologies, the physical reparations, those happened much earlier in their timeline.
Bet the internal shift took way longer.
Oh, absolutely. The deep spiritual and philosophical reclamation of their whole identity was a painfully slow generational process. The primary texts from this era actually use this really beautiful grounded analogy for it.
Oh, the stone analogy. I love this.
Yeah. They say the transformation accumulated the way warmth accumulates in a stone that's been left in the sunlight for a very long time.
It's such a perfect visual.
Right. It was gradual, it was thorough, and it just required constant exposure to a new way of thinking until the stone itself naturally became a source of heat.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to change a nation's identity that drastically, you have to completely dismantle and rebuild its cosmology.
You have to change the fundamental lens of reality.
Right. And during the imperial era, their whole worldview was built on a really flawed observation of nature. The military logic was basically, well, fire consumes the other elements. It burns earth, boils water, eats air. So fire must be inherently supreme.
Which is just a fundamentally broken way to look at it.
Exactly. They viewed it as the ultimate engine of progress. But the Soriyuna era scholars, they realized this wasn't just a moral failure. It was a misunderstanding of literal physics. They realized fire is not dominance. Fire is presence.
Yeah, if you look closely at the physics of a flame, it never actually conquers the air around it. It enters into a transformative reaction with it.
It's a relationship.
Exactly. It's a dynamic conversation. The air allows this transformation to occur, and that results in the release of light and warmth. Fire isn't operating in opposition to the environment at all.
It's completely dependent on it.
Right. It requires oxygen from the air to breed. It relies on fuel born from the earth. The big realization for the Soriyuna thinkers was that fire, without a reciprocal relationship, isn't a supreme power. It's just an isolated spark that burns itself out.
And I want to look at how this philosophical pivot actually altered the physical mechanics of firebending. Because if you read through the old imperial accounts, they treated breath almost like a mechanical bellows.
Just a pump.
Yeah, exactly. A soldier would take this massive intake of oxygen, pump it into the internal furnace of their chest, and just expel it as destructive force. Bigger breath equals bigger blast. It was purely quantitative.
But the records from the Soriyuna era show a complete departure from that mentality.
They really do. They started integrating these somatic practices. Like they began studying how the physical body directly experiences psychological states. So through this new lens, breath wasn't a mechanical pump anymore. It evolved into the ultimate emotional regulator.
Well, the practitioners discovered this inextricable link between the biological mechanics of breath and the psychological condition of the bender. And we see this in our own lives all the time.
For sure. Just think about being stressed.
Right. Think about how your body reacts when you're incredibly anxious, like during a tense meeting. Your shoulders creep up, your diaphragm locks down, your breathing gets all shallow and erratic.
You're literally bracing against yourself.
Exactly. You are physically bracing against internal tension. In the Soriyuna era, they realized that if a bender holds that kind of physical and emotional tension, it directly alters the combustion process of their bending.
Which is wild to think about.
What's fascinating here is how the flame becomes a literal, unavoidable diagnostic tool.
And the mechanics of that diagnosis are so cool to unpack, because a flame makes invisible tension entirely visible. When a bender is breathing freely, utilizing their full diaphragm, and their emotional interior is genuinely open, the fire reflects that.
It looks completely different.
It really does. Observers consistently describe this kind of flame as alive because the oxygen is flowing steadily, the internal pressure is balanced, so the fire burns at this rich, steady temperature.
It warms the space without searing it.
Yes. It illuminates a room without blinding everyone in it. It physically projects a welcoming presence.
Conversely, we can look at the output of a bender operating from a place of constricted breath, a place of suppressed
The
emotion.
marsh flames.
Right. If the body is braced against itself, forcing an unacknowledged feeling outward, the chemical reaction of the fire changes. The flame becomes highly pressurized, erratic.
Like it's snapping at the air.
Exactly. Observers noted these flames were much hotter, but in this really harsh, punishing way that caused the surrounding air to warp. They were blindingly bright, but completely lacked the quality of ambient warmth.
It's like the fire simply cannot lie.
It can't. It bypasses whatever the person claims they're feeling and just broadcasts the absolute biological truth of their internal state.
So, if we're dealing with a society where your outer expression, your flame, is a perfectly honest diagnostic tool, we have to ask what exactly it's diagnosing. Which leads us right to their core concept, the inner fire.
The foundation of their entire societal rebuild.
Right. And they don't use this as a poetic metaphor. They define the inner fire as the animating biological warmth at a person's core. It's your genuine identity, your passion, your inherent capacity for love and connection.
And the outer fire is just the exhaust.
Exactly. The actual bending is merely the physical expression of that internal engine. So the logic is, you cannot possibly produce a healthy outer fire if your inner fire is starving.
And maintaining that internal engine, it requires relentless psychological honesty.
Yeah.
You have to acknowledge what you actually desire, what you genuinely fear,
Right.
and you have to keep relationships open so your core is fed by connection.
But the medical texts from this era have this striking revelation, and this was a huge aha moment for me. They spent decades studying what actually diminishes the inner fire.
It's not what you'd expect.
No, because I assumed, looking at their history, that immense difficulty or trauma would be the main cause of a diminished spirit. Like, logically, trauma puts out the fire, right?
But the healers found the exact opposite.
Wait, really?
Yeah, if a person experiences severe suffering, but that suffering is met with steady, supportive presence from their community, the inner fire does not extinguish. It actually intensifies.
Wow.
The presence of others acts on the internal pain the exact same way a strong wind feeds a physical flame. The pain is processed as fuel.
So what actually kills it, then?
The real danger, the mechanism that kills the animating core, is prolonged suppression combined with forced isolation.
That makes so much sense.
We can trace the psychology directly. When an individual is forced to suppress their genuine self for an extended period, and they have to do it entirely alone, their internal energy has no outlet.
It has no one to warm.
Right. So the energy turns inward. It becomes this destructive loop where the inner fire consumes the psychological structure of the person. It burns up the identity it was supposed to nourish.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If isolation and suppression force the fire to turn inward, what happens when we look at the extreme opposite? A bender experiencing zero suppression and complete internal alignment.
Which brings us to lightning.
Yes, because in the old imperial records, lightning was about power and force. They called it the cold-blooded fire. It was this lethal tool that required a bender to violently sever themselves from their own emotions.
They had to create an artificial void to generate an unbalanced charge.
Basically weaponizing psychological dissociation.
Yeah.
So how does a culture of generative warmth redefine lightning?
Well, they completely reframed it. Lightning is no longer seen as a product of emotional amputation. In the Soryuna tradition, it is the physical manifestation of complete internal harmony.
The absolute opposite of suppression.
Exactly. To generate lightning, a bender has to fully acknowledge every opposing force within their own psyche. If you are angry and terrified at the same time, you don't push one feeling down. You sit with both until they are completely reconciled.
Which creates an internal stillness.
A stillness that is highly charged, but perfectly balanced.
And it's an internal state you cannot manufacture with sheer willpower. You can't just force psychological reconciliation.
No, you can only create the conditions for absolute honesty and allow the energy to arise naturally.
Advanced practitioners actually wrote that generating lightning under these conditions was the most honest, unfiltered experience of their lives. It's a moment of such profound internal truth that the human nervous system has no alternative but to express it as a physical release of light.
It's beautiful. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, This profound understanding birthed a massive societal pivot.
The shift from warriors to healers.
Right. Once they understood how suppression extinguishes the soul and how presence reignites it, the whole culture shifted. They dismantled the academies that trained conquerors and replaced them with academies for the healing arts.
They took the ashes of their own trauma and built a revolutionary medical practice based on intentional warmth, which they called honest heat.
Which is such a specific clinical term.
It is, and we should explain how a body can tell the difference. Like, how does your body distinguish between the ambient heat of a hot summer day and the honest heat provided by a trained healer?
It really comes down to the parasympathetic nervous system. Like when you sit by a hot radiator, the thermal receptors in your skin register the environment. Your body sweats to regulate temperature, but it's purely surface level.
But the healer's heat is different.
Completely different biological frequency. A skilled healer generates warmth directly from their own stabilized inner fire, not from forced breath. And they infuse that heat with concentrated psychological intention.
The intention of safety.
Exactly. The human nervous system is incredibly adept at recognizing the presence of another living creature. When a patient is enveloped in warmth that carries the specific intention of being welcomed and seen, their body drops its defensive posture.
The vagus nerve responds to that safety.
It does. It lowers the heart rate and allows the patient's suppressed energy to safely move outward.
The accounts from patients in these texts are deeply moving. When they try to articulate this somatic experience, they consistently use the phrase feeling remembered.
Oh, that's such a powerful word.
Right. They describe it as though the healer's physical presence was gently insisting on their existence. Think about walking through the world feeling completely invisible, heavily guarded, barely surviving. To have someone literally wrap your nervous system in the sensation of being known, it's a staggering medical intervention.
But it was incredibly delicate work
Mm.
because you can't force a diminished fire to reignite.
Right, applying too much heat will just snuff it out.
Exactly, which is how the trauma often occurred in the first place.
Yeah.
And this limitation led to one of the most remarkable cross-cultural partnerships in history.
The collaboration with the air nomads.
Yes, the medical collaboration between the Fire Nation healers and the Air Nomad somatic practitioners.
Because they were dealing with patients whose trauma was so severe that neither culture possessed the tools to heal them independently, the fire healers could provide the vital spark.
The intentional warmth.
Right, to jumpstart the biological engine. But without the proper environment, that sudden heat would be overwhelming. It would trigger a panic response and re-traumatize the patient.
And that is precisely where the Air Nomads became essential. While the fire healers provided the spark, the Air Nomads constructed what they called atmospheric safety
Using their elemental connection.
and deep psychological training. They managed the spatial and emotional environment. They ensured that as the patient's inner fire began to catch, it had an infinite, safe expanse of air to breathe into.
So they prevented the emotional release from becoming a suffocating backdraft.
Exactly, allowing the patient's energy to stabilize naturally.
To understand the philosophical impact of this, I love comparing it to a brilliant duet in music.
Well, I like that.
Yeah, because the imperial era's version of unity was basically a monoculture. Burn away all differences until only the Fire Nation remains. Even today, we often mistake unity for homogeneity, playing the exact same note.
Thinking everyone has to blur into one identity.
Right. But the success of fire and air working together birthed this new model called relational unity. It's like two completely different instruments playing in perfect responsive conversation. Or in ecology, it's like an estuary where a freshwater river meets the saltwater ocean.
That is an excellent framework, because an estuary is one of the most biologically productive ecosystems on the planet. And it's exactly because the fresh and salt water do not neutralize each other into some bland middle ground.
They maintain their extremes.
Right. They interact constantly. Relational unity is about genuinely different entities in full, sustained contact. They change and support one another, but fiercely maintain their distinct nature.
Fire needs the expansiveness of air to achieve combustion, and air requires the thermal energy of fire to create movement. Each element remains entirely itself and creates the conditions for the other to thrive.
And this realization scaled up to become the foundation for their international diplomacy, treating differences not as obstacles to eradicate, but as the fundamental ingredients for a sustainable global ecosystem.
So, as you process this incredible journey, how has society shifted from weaponized supremacy to offering the gift of generative warmth? I want you to turn that diagnostic lens inward.
Think about your own inner fire.
Exactly. Look at the environments you navigate every day. Are you feeding your animating core with genuine connection? Or are you operating in spaces that force you to brace your shoulders, hold your breath, and suppress your honest heat just to get by? Because the physiological mechanics remain true. A fire that is constantly isolated has no choice but to turn inward and consume the structure holding it.
And as you evaluate what's feeding or starving your own fire, I'll leave you with a final thought drawn from their philosophy on unity. We often think that to be close to someone or to find peace with another viewpoint, we must become like them or they must become like us.
Right, that homogenization.
But what if true unity, true relational fullness, actually requires us to fiercely maintain our differences? What if the only way to genuinely warm someone else is by having the courage to remain completely, honestly yourself?
Wow. The stone sits in the sunlight long enough, and eventually the stone itself becomes the source of heat. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.